Welcome everyone to this IPPR webinar on decarbonising the social housing sector. My name's Luke. I'm Associate Director at the Institute for Public Policy Research, and you're very welcome today. I'm also the head of our cross-party Environmental Justice Commission. Today we launched a new report that was supported generously by the Housing Association Stonewater, and it really is focused on how we deliver a massive energy efficiency programme and also low carbon heat in the social housing sector, but also across other tenures as well. I'm delighted that we're joined today by a number of fantastic speakers, including Thangun Debonair, who's the Labour Shadow Secretary of State for Housing, by Nicholas Harris, who's the Chief Executive of Stonewater Housing Association, by Amy Simmons, who is the Head of Policy at the National Housing Federation, and will soon be joined rushing from his, no doubt, his previous Zoom call to this next one, by Lord Deben, who is Chair of the Committee on Climate Change. So I'm gonna give a brief presentation shortly to give you a bit of an overview of our report, some of the key findings, our assessment of the current policy landscape, and also the key recommendations, although I will try and keep it brief. Then our speakers will give their response to the report, but also their own views on what they think needs to happen in order to decarbonise not just the social housing sector, but the wider housing stock, and talk a little bit around the benefits that will come through that. And then we'll get into a discussion with you all. Please do use the Q&A function if you would like to ask questions. You're welcome, of course, to undergo sort of some chat in the chat box, but if you want to ask a question, please do use the Q&A function. You can also use that function to upvote questions that you like. So if you don't have any of your own, or you spot another one that you like, then then you do have the option to upvote it there. And when it comes to time for questions, I'll be turning to my colleague Lara, who will be reading out your questions. But firstly, I'm going to go straight into a very short presentation to give an overview of the report before we go to our speakers. So Lara, if you wouldn't mind putting up the presentation. Sorry, I'm just having a classic technical difficulty. Right, thanks very much. Yes, if you want to go to the next slides, Lara. So just to give a very brief overview of the report really makes the case for an ambitious investment programme to deliver household improvements across the country. We've seen a lot of debate around the advantages of a retrofit programme and a low carbon heat programme across the country. And certainly this report makes the case for that. We know that it will bring with it significant benefits, which will include mass job creation. These projects, certainly in the case of energy efficiency, are shovel ready, and there's a really positive high distribution of jobs evenly across the country. This really is something that can be done in every region. There's also significant benefits in terms of lower energy bills, lower carbon emissions, which is obviously one of the central objectives, but also brings these other benefits, including greater energy security as well. But the key conclusions of the report, which I'll go into in more detail shortly, really are that additional investment and a real comprehensive plan are required in order to make this happen. And that's what this report does. It sets out a home improvement plan for England in order to deliver that. Next slide. So in the report, we analyse the technological solutions to ensure that the housing sector can be decarbonised. We use and draw on much of the research from the Committee on Climate Change to understand what we think are the best technological solutions in different areas. We also look at the regulation and support that would be needed to help not just the social sector, but also the wider housing tenures, including the private rented sector and the owner-occupied sector, in order to meet our objectives of decarbonising them. Very briefly, we undertook, as part of the research, a review of the current policies that are in place to understand the state of play in the social rented sector, and also more broadly. We undertook analysis to understand what the costs are associated with the proposed low carbon heating pathways, but also for a widespread energy efficiency programme as well. We also undertook analysis of the key barriers to undertaking retrofit work, which I'll go into in a little more detail shortly. We tested our ideas with experts and tenants. We held some focus groups with some of Stonewater's tenants to understand some of their anxieties and also what they viewed as the opportunities for a programme like this. And then finally, we formulated our policy recommendations in consultation with those experts and testing the ideas with the tenants that we spoke to as well. Next slide. So many of you are all watching this webinar will already be aware of what the problems and the challenges are. A bit in brief, we know that we need to reduce residential buildings emissions by 82.5% by 2050. Our housing stock makes a significant contribution to our carbon emissions, so it remains a big challenge. While the social rented sector, which this report focuses on, performs best, not least because of previous programmes like the Decent Homes programme, the Decent Homes Standard and alike, there's still a long way to go in the social rented sector, but also in other sectors, the private rented sector and the owner-occupied sector too. We know that we also face a huge fuel poverty crisis in the UK. The latest evidence suggests that 2.4 million households are unable to afford to heat their homes across the UK. But we know that also that, you know, as a result of COVID, this is likely to have been exacerbated and made worse. And then just in terms of the scale of the challenge, in terms of meeting those targets of decarbonising the sector, we need to have see at least 21 million separate energy efficiency measures delivered, 19 million heat pumps need to be installed in the next 30 years, and we also need to see 5 million homes connected to heat networks as well. And we've estimated that the cost for just the social rented sector alone, depending on the approach pursued, could be between 35 and 65 billion pounds. So it's no small task. There's also a challenge around the skills that we need to do. We know the skills that we need to deliver this. So we know it's a huge potential job creator, but we do need to create these jobs, and we also need to fulfill the skill gaps in order to deliver that as well. And then there's just the concern of the wider buildings industry, which is still carbon intensive and very much geared, unfortunately, towards the carbon age. Next slide. So in terms of that, the summary of findings, we analysed, as I said, the technological solutions and what we think is the best way of approaching this problem. And in line with the CCC advice from the Committee on Climate Change, we found that certainly certain particularly dense and urban areas would be best served by what are called heat networks. But that actually for the majority of households, heat pumps would be the most effective in meeting a net zero target. You know, this pathway does acknowledge the crucial role for other technologies such as hydrogen boilers and high heat retention storage heaters in some contexts. So we don't deny that actually they are needed, but heat pumps need to be a big part of this, and it's an area that we are significantly behind on as a country. But in all cases, and we certainly welcome the government's recent announcement on this, energy efficiency retrofitting will be crucial to meeting the carbon objectives that we need to achieve, but also to reduce costs for consumers. But then we also find there are a number of barriers to delivering this, or indeed any retrofit programme that is set out. Firstly is the insufficient scale and funding. So we know that the government announced a very welcome £2 billion for a voucher scheme, most likely for homeowners to deliver energy efficiency improvements in homes across the country. We don't yet have enough detail about that, but our research certainly finds that that won't be sufficient even for homeowners and certainly the private residential sector, and there certainly isn't enough at the moment being committed for the social sector either, with just £50 million committed for the social sector over the next year. We also find that the regressive distribution or prohibitive costs need to be addressed. So the on-bill financing, for instance, for what's called for the government's eco programme proves to be extremely expensive for those on the lowest incomes, and there's also prohibitive upfront costs, even with what some might consider to be quite generous grants of a few £1,000s or more. It's still quite prohibitive, particularly for those on the lowest incomes. There's also a number of non-financial barriers that need to be tackled as well. There's very low public awareness of what needs to be done in terms of tackling this challenge. We did some polling ourselves, and while there was greater knowledge around energy efficiency measures, there was very little known around the measures such as heat pumps, ground source heat pumps and alike. And a Bayes survey, a government survey, revealed a similar evidence just a couple of years ago as well. Secondly, there's also issues around access to households and also space restrictions as well. Different homes, all of different types, different sizes, and indeed containing different households. There is a huge challenge in this process of actually being able to deliver these measures in homes across the country that need to be overcome, and we don't yet have the programme that we need to overcome that barrier. There's also the significant barriers in terms of the disruption it's going to cause to certain households and how we handle that as well. And there's also different challenges across tenures too. So the challenges in the private rented sector include the fact that there's less incentive potentially for private landlords to invest in measures, not least because they don't see the benefit in terms of the reduction in the bills. And that some of those problems also apply in the social sector as well. There's also barriers for delivery partners as well, including a lack of capacity and funding for local councils and housing associations, and the need to train up the installer workforce. Next slide. And just to kind of reiterate some of those findings with the polling that we conducted. So we know, perhaps unsurprisingly, that of those, more than 2 in 5 of UK adults that were polled by Savanta Comres in conjunction with IPPR, who have actually considered installing energy improvement measures, but haven't, they cite the high upfront costs as the most common reason for not doing so. And as I said, those upfront costs are even greater for low-income households as well. And it's also true that when we think about the payment mechanism as well, that nearly half of the UK public say that reducing carbon emissions from housing should be paid for through either general taxation or government borrowing, compared to much fewer people who suggest it should be delivered through higher energy bills. Next slide. So our report essentially sets out what we've called a new home improvement plan for England, and we do think actually framing it around the idea of home improvements rather than just carbon emissions and carbon emission savings is much more tangible and appealing to households across the country. We call on the government to actually choose a clear technological pathway now, so that supply chains and processes can be quickly scaled up to bring overall costs down. The government has yet to do this, but we think it is an important thing to do. We also think the government, in order to do that, we also think that will achieve the building of the necessary supply chains that we need to see, the scaling up of the workforce and developing the skills needed to deliver a widespread programme. Unlike what the government announced last week, we also think that social housing should be the trailblazer and should be at the vanguard, really, of delivering the first wave of a nationwide programme of retrofits, building on the progress already made in the sector. And that rapid uptake in the social sector and scaled up supply chains would also help attract more private investment into retrofitting. It's much easier, for instance, to aggregate and lever in private investment for the social housing sector, which could then have knockover, spillover benefits for when we're focusing on the private rented sector and owner-occupier housing as well. Next slide. So in order to deliver this, we set up, we call for a number of recommendations, and I would encourage you to go away and read the report. It's quite hefty, coming in at around 60 or 70 pages. We like our long reports at IPPR, but there is an executive summary if you want to save time and just read the first 4 pages. But the key recommendations really here are that we must establish a retrofit fund for England, building on the government's commitment last week. So that's 5.3 billion per year through to 2030 and 3.5 billion a year thereafter. And in the next 10 years, that includes 1.8 billion dedicated for the social sector, which will be scaling up the government's commitment significantly to the sector. We also think that the government should work with the private sector to match this amount as part of a blended funding model. We know that public money on its own is not going to deliver what we need, so we do need to lever in private money, and the government, and as it says in the report, the Bank of England also has a role in levering in that private investment. We think the retrofit fund should be used to provide households with grants to cover at least half the cost of heat pump installation, with also the remainder subject to means tested support. For private landlords, we believe that they should be offered low cost loans. But we also think it needs to be coupled with or allied with strong measures to ensure that this actually happens. I think one of the lessons of the past is that we can't just rely on incentives. So we do need to see tougher targets around minimum energy efficiency standards for the private rented sector. We call for at least B by 2030. But we also call for similar standards to be introduced across all private housing at the point of sale, and also when major retrofits or other improvements are being made underway by the homeowner as well. And those standards can be ratcheted up over time. We also call on the government to explore the possibility of using council tax rates or stamp duty relief in order to incentivise greater energy efficiency. Given the level of public awareness revealed by our polling and also the work by others, including BEIS, we also call on the government to scale up existing support to create a widely accessible and dedicated advice service. And finally, also to invest in a large-scale training programme for clean heat installers. So that's just a kind of as brief as possible overview of a very long report. There are many other recommendations in the report which I would encourage you to go away and read. And again, I'd just like to thank all of those that participated in the research and that contributed, many of which I know are attending today, and also to Stonewater again for their support in providing the research. But I'm going to turn to our first speaker to give her thoughts and the Labour Party's thoughts on both on our report and on the wider agenda as well. Over to you, Thangam.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you, Luke. Successfully unmuted, I hope. And I am hugely grateful to the IPPR both for inviting me today and for this report. It fits in with Labour priorities around climate change, job creation, housing justice, energy efficiency, all those things which Luke has so ably just described, but also about transforming social housing stock, and that's for the sake of our public health as well as for our climate change ambitions. And I've reflected a lot on the consequence of the COVID crisis and the impact on our everyday lives and what it's taught us about our housing. And I hope that we have all recommitted to the need for everybody to have a safe, warm, secure, truly affordable home, which is contributing to us meeting our climate change targets by being zero carbon. Because of our experiences in this lockdown, I became a shadow housing secretary during the lockdown, and I really feel that it was in some ways good preparation, though not one I would have chosen, to have to think about the impact on people of living in homes that are cold, damp, hard to heat or expensive to heat, particularly given that this crisis is a respiratory illness crisis, particularly given what we know from, for instance, the Resolution Foundation's analysis a couple of weeks ago about the differential risks for BME people, for people on low incomes, which again reflects onto the need that the IPPR have established for an investment in social housing measures. Now, The Chancellor Rishi Sunak has announced the 50 million social housing decarbonisation fund for supporting a demonstrator pilot. It doesn't feel enough to me. I'm not really convinced that this is what we need. I think we need more urgency than that. The Conservative Party's manifesto was much more ambitious, and I'd like them to make good on that. I'll make a couple of party political points, but I'll move on to the more general, because I think it's important to be honest and say, it was a Labour Chancellor, Gordon Brown, who announced that all new homes should be zero carbon by 2016. And 2016, of course, is 4 years ago, and we were very disappointed that the government coming in 2015, when I became an MP, scrapped the Green Deal of the previous coalition government. That's a Tory Lib Dem coalition government, but it also scrapped Labour's zero carbon homes target and the Code for Sustainable Homes. I was pleased and to represent a party that brought in the world's first climate change act, but again I think this has cross-party support, so it's a shame that some of those measures over the last 10 years haven't had the same vocal commitment, in my opinion. So the Green Homes grant overall, the 2 billion, it's not nothing, but it's not what we were promised in the manifesto. And I really hope that the government recognises the potential here for actually fulfilling on their commitment to levelling up their own agenda. That's replacing old industrial jobs, long gone, with new energy efficiency jobs and a commitment to training. And that's what's reflected in this report, is the potential for that. We would like the Conservatives to deliver on that promise of spending 9.2 billion. We think that the summer statement that the Chancellor made last week was a missed opportunity, but there's still chance for that later on in the year. Now we have unemployment figures rising sharply. We think there's never been a better time. There was always a need for this, but there's never been a more important or more urgent time to train and employ a zero carbon workforce to help insulate homes. So we're going to need to do various things. We're going to need to recognise, and we're going to need the government to recognise, that half of our social housing doesn't meet the required standards, and that the government itself, quite rightly, wants those homes to meet that standard by 2035. But in order to meet that, we're going to need to move rapidly. And I think that there's a way in which the social housing sector and housing associations like Stonewater, and I welcome what Nicholas has said today in Inside Housing about what Stonewater's doing, they can demonstrate a model of good practice in their work with the private sector on standards, on competency in a workforce, on engagement with tenants and owners. And I think that's really important, because this will represent quite a substantial degree of disruption to people's homes while the necessary works are being carried out. But I also think it sends really clear signals to the market about the potential of the value and the proof of concept of any government investment. Sorry. The travails of working from home. And still failing to turn my phone off. That managed it at last, apologies. So I also think a major challenge for us all is to think about how we inspire the young people who we need to retrain and retrain to take up these jobs. Back in February, which seems like a dim and distant world now, Greta Thunberg was outside my office in Bristol with thousands of young people, all concerned about climate change. I want them all to go back to school with a renewed fervour to learn the skills that they need to install heat pumps and insulate cold homes. And we've got to try and find a way of inspiring young people to want to make that leap between campaigning fervour and actually learning to do the jobs that we need. This programme, if we took up the IPPR recommendations, it could bring jobs and benefits across the whole country. Labour supports that approach in our urge for a Green New Deal. We think it could save the carbon equivalent of taking millions of cars off the road, the same amount of energy as 6 Hinkley C nuclear power stations, and reduce household energy costs by £270 each year. Again, these are things reflected in the report, but I just wanted to make sure that it's clear that Labour's policy is reflecting that. And we want our local authorities, who we know what needs doing house by house, street by street, we want them to have the tools and the funding to get on with that in their own stock, but also in social housing and private rented stock. But we do need the government to make good on their election promise of the amount of money they said they were going to bring. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much. That was a really good overview of Labour's policy, and yes, the problems of working from home with the phone there. Well, thanks very much, and I just wanted to welcome Lord Deben as well, and thank him for joining us. I'm going to turn to Nicholas Harris next in terms of his response, but welcome Lord Deben. Thanks for joining us.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name's Nick Harris. I'm Chief Exec of Stonewater. I'd like to thank Luke and the team at IPPR for delivering such an ambitious report today. And as Chief Exec of a major housing association, one of the challenges I've been grappling with is how do we meet the zero carbon target whilst also making sure that we reduce or trying to eradicate fuel poverty, but also in a way that's affordable to us as an organisation and to us as a country. So I think this report sets out an exciting and ambitious roadmap for us to meet some of those targets. So just a little bit about Stonewater. We're a traditional housing association. We've got about 33,000 homes, mainly, well, all in England. We have general needs, we have supported housing, we have foyers for young people, we have safe spaces for people fleeing domestic violence, with retirement living. So we deliver services across the whole range of needs within our communities. We work with all sorts of organisations, whether they be parish councils, district councils, unitary councils, central government, Homes England. We're very used to working with a number of different agencies around the country. So for me, there's three key challenges really. One is the scale of the challenge of meeting zero carbon by 2050. The second is what we're doing at Stonewater. And the third challenge is what should we be doing with the government and industry. So if I just look at the scale of the challenge, we've got 33,000 homes at Stonewater. We estimate 27,000 of them will need extensive investment in retrofitting. So that's just an example of the scale of the challenge across the country. There's 4 million social housing homes in England, and we would estimate well over 3 million will need a significant investment to meet the targets. We also want to tackle fuel poverty, and we want to also ensure that whatever we're doing is sustainable for our customers, but for us as a business. So at Stonewater, what we've done is we've set ourselves a target of getting to EPC level C by 2030. When we've met that target, that would have meant that we had an investment and that retrofitted 8,500 homes. We're currently modelling a target of B, EPC level B, by 2035. We're modelling that because obviously we're not clear on what the costs will be to us as a business and how affordable that will be. We've also entered a partnership with Ilka Homes. They're one of the new modern methods of construction businesses based up in North Yorkshire. We've got a really exciting opportunity in Hereford. We're going to be building over 120 modern homes using factory methods of construction. So that's another way of improving our carbon footprint. We also are doing a number of off-grid heat pumps in rural or semi-rural areas. We've got several hundred properties now that are using ground source heat pumps. And we've just started a really exciting project in Oxford. Oxford's part of the Energy Super Hub. And we're working with Kensor heat pumps to install heat pumps using a just-in-time tariff with Octopus electricity to not only provide energy efficient heating, but also economic heating by way of the tariff, so that the new method of heating should be no more expensive than what would have been the old gas tariff. And that's really important because for our customers, energy poverty is a huge challenge. And for many of our customers, after their rent, the energy bill is the next big bill that they pay. So what can the government do? The government actually, Luke and Thang have already said, the government made £50 million available for pilots. That is a great start. It's obviously not sufficient. They've made available the energy insulation grants for homeowners, up to £10,000. I was reading in The Guardian this morning, and that's great. But that needs to be extended out to social housing tenants as well, because I think for us to really meet this challenge, we need to actually have a blended approach where we as a business are prepared to make a significant investment, but we also believe that there should be an investment by central government. And we also think that there should be some sort of investment by our residents as well, because where we want to get to is, you know, the golden solution is where we've got cheaper energy for our customers, warmer homes for our customers, and homes that are more sustainable and have met the carbon reduction challenge. So I think this is a really ambitious paper, and I think what this does is not only helps us reduce our carbon footprint, but it will provide over 270,000 jobs in clean, green employment across the country. I think Luke and Thangan both said, you know, if we make this investment, this is something that will apply all over the country and give jobs to young people and people that perhaps are currently employed, new skills that they can train for. So it not only reduces unemployment, it actually reduces our carbon footprint, which is a fantastic result, and it actually should also tackle the big energy challenge for our residents. So I think this is a really ambitious roadmap. I'm really excited of working with IPPR and our partners in government and elsewhere to go out and deliver the findings of this report to reduce our carbon footprint as a country, make the planet better for our children and grandchildren, but also provide more sustainable, warmer homes for people that are cheaper to run. So I think this is a fantastic report, and I would really suggest, you know, I'm going to work very hard to deliver this route map. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nicholas. It was great to hear, kind of from a really practical perspective, what you're doing to upgrade the homes within your stock. Next, I'm going to turn to Amy Simmons from the National Housing Federation. Amy.
Thanks very much, Luke. That's great. Hi, everybody. I'm Amy Simmons, and I'm Head of Policy at the National Housing Federation. And most of you will probably know, but we're the trade body for housing associations. So I'm really delighted to be here as part of the launch of this report. It is excellent. It's really insightful. It's definitely worth a read. I'm looking forward to going back and really getting into the detail. And I think the discussion will be really interesting too. Just going to try and take the opportunity to say a bit more about the work that the Federation is currently doing with our members and other stakeholders in support of the report's ambition and its recommendations. And then I'll try and expand a bit on where I see particular challenges and opportunities based on discussions that we've had to date with our members. So the first thing to say that there's really broad alignment between the recommendations of the report and the focus of our work on recovery after the coronavirus, and we absolutely agree that housing has a really important role to play in the national recovery, economic recovery. So we believe that the recovery can be a catalyst for a better future for our nation, but there's fierce competition for money across government, and economic forecasts are not great. So we know, because we work with them all the time, but housing associations have played a vital part in the response to the crisis, and we've seen some amazing examples of work, agile working, adopting new approaches, really supporting residents and communities. And if you think about the what coronavirus has done to many businesses and their construction as well, the construction processes, as well as supporting their residents, it's really been impressive. So now we're building a case for social housing to be at the heart of the recovery, which I think is really important, and it really does back up what the last two speakers have been saying. So we're going to look at doing this in two ways. So we're going to set out a comprehensive policy plan for how social housing can support the national recovery. And many of you will have seen that the other week we recently launched our Homes at the Heart campaign. So this is a national campaign and coalition calling for a once-in-a-generation investment in social housing in all its forms to be at the heart of the recovery. And this has been supported by a huge number of organisations, anyone from Care UK to NatWest. But importantly, it's a coalition of those that support the sector. And we're really looking to take that message out more widely to government, to MPs, but also the public as well. So we've had a fantastically positive response. And actually that approach really does align with the ambition of the report. And I think it's worth noting that it's recognition that back to normal isn't enough for the people that have struggled in lockdown, the people that have helped us respond to it, to the coronavirus. And there's been a real surge in appreciation of the kind of things that social housing is all about. So that's being active in the community, care and support, secure, comfortable homes, things that make being at home bearable, and decarbonisation of homes is a really massive part of this, because it does have such a huge impact on whether homes are warm or whether they overheat, whether they're cold, all sorts of things, huge impacts for health, as Langham was saying before. And then so the other strand of this work that we're taking forward is our policy plan for recovery. And it's got 5 goals, and we've really developed those in conjunction with our members by talking to them about their ambition and what they'd like to see. So very briefly, they include no return to rough sleeping, a new generation of affordable homes, helping people to thrive in their homes, which I think is really linked to this discussion. Importantly, a new drive to decarbonise social housing, also hugely aligned, and change for communities across the country, and that's very much linked with the levelling up, skills replacement, making sure that everybody has the ability to afford where they live and have a quality home. So we're still really looking at feedback, looking for feedback, and particularly in relation to our decarbonisation and community asks, and we'll be sharing more information with our members over the coming weeks. So it's an exciting time. But specifically thinking about decarbonisation of social housing, we know that it's an essential part of tackling climate change and hitting our zero carbon emission targets. And we've also spoken about the major benefits for residents and communities, addressing fuel poverty and rising bills, preventing vulnerable people from having to live in poor quality homes, reducing pressure on health services, and providing skilled jobs. Also the associated infrastructure, investment in green infrastructure and the role it has to stimulate the economy. But we also know that housing associations are really keen and want to be at the forefront of this decarbonisation. And just what Nicholas was saying, I think really shows that. And we know there are lots of our members who are really starting to, they've used the time during lockdown to really start planning, to look at what their options are, to really start to review their business planning and how they will make some of this decarbonisation actually happen. But we also know that they face significant challenges, such as the lack of finance, skill shortages, competing demands and priorities. And many of those are really highlighted by the report. Completely agree with them. So what we're planning to do is to work with our members to explore how we can best support the sector on the journey to net zero in 2050, and how we can specifically add value. So the work that we can do to support the sector that others won't. So, you know, what is it that we will do that others won't? So how can we bring the sector and others together? And this report is really an excellent starting point to help along those discussions. So what we're hoping to provide as part of that work is a sector-wide vision and ambition for decarbonisation, and this will encompass how we'll work with government and the sector. Massively importantly, how we'll engage with residents and understand their concerns, their views, how we can actually take steps to work in partnership with them to make sure that everybody is happy with the outcomes that are that we end up with. So also considering new financing options, cost sharing models, and improving cooperation and collaboration across the sector and beyond. And I think you just touched on some of the issues, Nicholas, that actually a lot of the policy we have around cost sharing and energy supply they're predicated on models which will change over time, and we really do need to make sure that we have looked at what the other options are and whether they actually work for us. So we're calling on government to provide policy certainty, set robust and ambitious standards and targets, and deliver a long-term social housing decarbonisation fund on top of the pilot that was announced last week. And we think that the key points that are really needing to be discussed and addressed to support meaningful progress in the future are continuity of funding from a range of sources. The pilot is great, but we can't waste time. We've got a very specific 10 years or so to really get an enormous amount of work done. And if we wait too long for the end of a pilot, we need to be moving forward on some of the issues that where we know actions can be taken in parallel, so that we start to address some of the decarbonisation that we need. I think government has a really key role to play in sort of strategic oversight and facilitation, making sure that where we put our funding and our effort is efficient, it can be rolled out at scale, that capacity is increased, that supply chains respond, and that we have skills in the right places. And personally, I spend a lot of time working on building safety, and we've been through quite a lot of very similar issues in terms of build quality, working with residents, capacity, coverage, access, culture, build quality, assurance, you name it. We've already thought about it, talked about it. There's a real need to share some of that experience. I think there's massive opportunities for new partnerships, consumer engagement more generally. We're not going to be able to take some of the actions we need to across tenures unless we have that. Local authorities are key, but also the private sector too. And I think there's a real role for governance backed by assurance and trust, so linked to an agreed approach to performance. We need to make sure that we do some of the basic fabric insulation first before we get into changing heating systems potentially, so we don't end up with bills being raised inadvertently for vulnerable residents. But we also need to make sure we can specify trusted products, that we're looking at performance and data and monitoring, that making sure that we are still on track and that what we're working to is fit for purpose. So I think I'm going to wrap up now, but I think this is the start of the sector, a sector who is really well placed to quickly develop a position about what it really wants and needs and its expectations in order to make decarbonisation happen. And that's why it's so exciting. So there's a real opportunity for us to show leadership in terms of how that's achieved, continuing the work we already do to support residents and their communities. And that's what makes this work so exciting going forward.
Thanks very much, Amy, and good to hear that there's just so much in common in terms of the themes and the content of our report, and what you were talking about there, about what the Federation is doing and the priorities for the sector. I'm delighted to hand over now to Lord Deben, who's chair of the Committee on Climate Change. Thank you for joining us. I think you might have missed my presentation, but hopefully you've had an overview of our report beforehand. But I'm sure you won't be short of things to talk about in terms of decarbonising the housing stock and the social housing stock in particular. Over to you, Lord Deben.
Well, thank you very much. In fact, I did get most of your introduction, and I have read the executive summary too, and can say very clearly that this report is entirely in line with what the Climate Change Committee has asked for. It's entirely in line with the letter that we wrote to the Prime Minister very soon after he was elected, and in line with the report which we published, I suppose, 3 weeks ago, which was our annual report, which comes out every June under the Climate Change Act, in which we made it very clear that our belief was that the only way in which we can effectively come out of COVID and turn this emergency into real emergence was by concentrating on energy efficiency and on the way in which we heat our homes. Now, it's not the only thing, there are a whole range of other things, but it is a central thing for reasons which the report properly emphasises and which we too have emphasised. First of all, it's a mechanism which you can spread over the whole country. It's a mechanism which you can also help the poorest and those most disadvantaged, as well as the most disadvantaged parts of the country. So it's a mechanism which also employs people all over the country. And it's a mechanism too, which ensures that people can live very much more fulfilled lives while not destroying the climate. I mean, we really do have to recognise these two things come together. And when some rather ill-informed commentators suggest that, you don't want to do this because there's a quicker way, we just have to go back to what we were doing before, this is sort of balmy, because it's not possible. There is only one way, and that way is to create a more resilient and sustainable society. And housing is at the heart of that. Now, your report was about social housing in particular and rented housing in general. I just want to make one point, and that is that we've got to stop building crap houses now. In other words, we've actually got to accept the fact that since the Climate Change Committee laid down the fact that we needed some proper regulation about new houses, there have been 1 million homes which we're going to have to retrofit, and some of those have been homes built for social purposes. So that, I mean, this is not just the private sector. I do think that the house builders have a very great deal to answer for. 9 house builders building 80% of our homes, and their answer to all this is to say, well, the government has got to take the lead. Well, I think they could have done a bit of leadership themselves. So the first part is, of course, that many of the existing homes were not actually built even to the pretty low levels of building regulations that we have. And one of the problems is that we don't inspect properly and we don't enforce properly. And I put that into this discussion because I don't think it is sensible just to talk about rented accommodation or social accommodation. We have to see that in the whole context of an attitude towards accommodation, towards homes, which should be a wholly different one from the one that we have at the moment. And the reason for that is really a very fundamental, I think, frankly, ethical reason. If you build a house which is not properly insulated and not properly ventilated, you put the cost of that onto the person who buys that house or rents that house for the rest of that house's time. What you're doing is shifting your own responsibility as the builder or developer, or indeed as the social provider, whoever it is, you shift that responsibility to the rent payer, the mortgage payer. So I've always believed that there is a fundamental falsehood in this, and that falsehood is an ethical falsehood. Before you get on to any argument about economic sense, that it's also not sensible, but it is also, it says something about our attitudes, which we really do have to change. Second thing to remember is that housing goes on practically forever, particularly in Britain. We have a lot of houses which have been built a long time ago. And unless you do change them, then you go on having this trouble, not just with the new houses, which you should get started in the right way, but you go on having this trouble. And I have 2 experiences which really brought this home to me. First of all, I went to that very good housing association, Hasto, which does some really good work and has done actually more passive houses than anyone else has done in the social sector. And I went to one of their village groups of houses, and I met a woman who said to me, well, she said, I'm really happy. She said, I've lived in a council house before and I've now moved into this house. She said every month I save £30 towards my my energy bill in the winter, she said, and I've always done that. And I've been saving the £30 in this place, she said, because I didn't realise that when my bill came, it was £15 for the year. She said, I had £300. I've never had £300 before. I had it for me, for myself. And I thought to myself, this is the second ethical thing, is that unless you provide the possibility of people having housing, and not just housing, but heating at a reasonable price, you don't actually meet our social requirements. That's why I would like to see it impossible to quote a rent or quote a mortgage without the cost of heating to be with it. Because I don't agree with you, Nicholas, actually. It isn't that that heating comes second to the rent. I think it's the same level, and I know an awful lot of people who've paid for their heating and then can't pay for their rent. I mean, I do think we have to recognise these two things come together, and if you want the rent paid, the heating has got to cost a lot less. And the only way you do that is by retrofitting the houses in a way which is satisfactory. Now, I think I mean, I am entirely independent, having been appointed by a Liberal Democrat in the House, in the UK Parliament, a Welsh Socialist, a Scottish Nationalist, and a Protestant Unionist. So to have a long-term Conservative and a Catholic is quite a surprise. But anyway, they ended up with me, and I am absolutely independent about this. I want to praise things that are good and attack things that are bad. It's quite wrong to get rid of the zero carbon housing, quite wrong. And it's very good that the government has done what it has done. And I particularly like the fact that it's trying to do that in this 1 year, as long as what it then does is to extend it in a more sensible long-term policy. I think it is sensible, frankly, to get this thing started. And I'm not going to be in the position of saying, well, there should be more, there should be less. I just think we get it started. But there are three real difficulties, and my only criticism of the, and I have to say it was the executive summary of the report, my only criticism is I don't think that you have laid enough emphasis on the terrible skill shortage that we have and the need to train people to do these jobs. I think we're in real difficulty in meeting even the money which we're going to spend now. You only have to talk to any builder, and he will tell you, she will tell you exactly one thing, which is that they find it almost impossible to fulfill the jobs they've got now with proper skills. And that is particularly true when it comes to the issue of building the equivalent of passive houses. Now, I don't particularly like the passive house mechanism, but what it ends up with is the right thing. In other words, you need that. And the Climate Change Committee has made it absolutely clear what the measurement should be. But if we use the word passive house because people understand, roughly speaking, what you're aiming at, the fact is that this needs all sorts of things. It needs better training. It needs retraining and reskilling. It needs more people, and it also needs a very big expansion, as Amy Simmons has pointed to, a very big expansion of off-site building and modern building if we're going to get this done properly, because that is one of the ways we're going to do it. But I said there was another experience which I had. I was in Wales looking at what the Welsh government, which is very good on a number of these things, what the Welsh government has done in terms of in terms of social housing. And it's very interesting to see the remarkable effect of doing this in terms of lowering people's bills, but also of making people able to live a decent life. I talked to a senior teacher in the local school, and he said, well, at long last, we have children coming to school dry instead of wet in the winter because they are in wet homes. Now, there are problems, and I just think one of the things that I hope the IPPR will help us look at, there are problems particularly where you have had purchasing of a number of houses in an estate, because one of the things we have to do is to try to do these things together. It's so much cheaper and more effective if you actually deal with the whole of an estate in bringing it up to date. And some of the worst examples of that will have to be done that way. And we've got to find better ways of encouraging not only the tenants, as Fangam quite rightly said, the tenants are going to be under very considerable periods of disruption. But we've also got to find ways of helping those people who own their own homes amongst those to take a part in it. One of the sadnesses looking at this particular estate were the 3 or 4 homes who'd refused to join in, even though they were going to get this for free, but they just didn't want it, so they weren't having it. And it seemed to me such a pity that we hadn't managed to do that. We've got to find better ways of bringing everyone together. The last thing I want to say is this. I don't think that we should be talking about prioritizing one above another. If we are going to meet the fourth and fifth carbon budget. If we are going to meet the net zero demand for 2050, we've got to do it right across the board. We've got to do it with private sector houses. We've particularly got to do it with the private rented accommodation as against the social accommodation. And may I say one thing about that? I think the government was entirely wrong to have this rule which says that landlords don't have to make the changes that are going to bring the standard of the house up even to the most reasonable one, if it's going to cost more than £3,000. I mean, frankly, those are the very houses which actually ought to be done first, because if they need that amount of change in order for them to be, in my view, livable in, then that is absolutely essential as a priority, not putting a ceiling on it. And you've got to find a way of making it possible. And if it isn't possible for landlords to be forced to do it, then you must have some kind of mechanism whereby those houses are certainly done with. We've got to do it with new housing. That's why we've got to have the future homes standards enforced, and we've got to have them measured. And we've got to have the same work done in social housing. And I much appreciate this report. The last thing I want to say is this. This is central. And one of the things that was very good about your report was that you took seriously the issue about how you get there. And we as a committee have been very concerned about what I'd call the purists, who say you have to make a single jump. And therefore, we've got to have the hydrogen economy tomorrow, and we've got to do this. And the fact is, we haven't got the hydrogen economy. Maybe we'll get it. I hope we will. We've asked for significant spending on it, but we aren't there yet. What we need at the moment is hybrid answers, which is a hybrid boiler with a heat pump, because that reduces the amount of fossil fuels you use enormously, and it gets people on the way, and it means that you can in fact use presently existing equipment in many cases. And that surely is what we ought to be doing if we're trying to do something about reducing our carbon footprint. Not to think that you can scrap the lot and put this new stuff in when we hardly know how we do it. So I liked very much the incremental proposals, not because in the end we don't have to do the whole lot, not because in the end we have to be net zero by 2050, but because we've got to start now. We've got to start immediately. There is no time to waste, and the hybrid answer is the only way to get through that. And a reform of the renewable heat incentive is crucial if we're going to have the result we want. The result we want is a society in which people have decent homes, society in which people can afford to be warm, that can know that they can ventilate their houses in the very much hotter weather that we're more likely to have much more regularly, and a society which stops destroying the future by its use of energy in heating its homes.
Thanks very much. That was a really, really comprehensive overview of what's needed, and I couldn't agree more on what your sort of powerful comments around new housing. I think it's we don't want to be here in 10, 15 years time talking about spending money to decarbonise and fix housing that we're building at the moment, and agree again with you on the skills challenges. It may not have been in the exact summary, but it's definitely buried within more deeply within the longer report. But totally agree with you there on the skills challenges. I'm going to go straight to questions. We've got about half an hour for discussion. I can see there's been lots of questions asked in the box. I know that some of them are directed primarily around what we did or didn't consider for the report. I think for those ones, I'm happy to answer some of them, but in the interest of not abusing my position of chair, I think it might be useful to think about those questions more broadly, because I think they all relate to kind of the considerations that we all have around the sector. But I'll hand over to Lara to maybe give us the first three.
Hi everyone, thank you for some wonderful questions. So the first one is from Philippa, and she asks, do you recommend look at the role local authorities can play in rolling out retrofitting programs? And do you look at the resources local authorities may need in enforcing minimum energy efficiency standards, etc.? So that's the first one from Philippa. The second one from Sam asks, did the IPPR consider the role that new builds has on decarbonising the social housing sector? Many of the landlords, sorry, it's jumped, someone's liked it, so it's jumped up. Many of the landlords we work with obtain a large proportion of their new stock through Section 106 acquisitions and don't believe they have the bargaining power to require developers to go beyond building regulations for energy efficiency, as if they don't buy the homes. Another housing association will. And another one from Glenn. Should we be asking HMRC to reduce VAT from 20% to 0 for all products and installation costs, which improve energy efficiency of the home? Thank you.
Thanks very much. There's some really great questions there. I suppose the role of the local authorities, what role they should be playing, should be reducing VAT, and then the role of new build housing as well. I'll come to Nicholas first, and then Thangham, and then Lord Deben, and then Amy. Don't feel the need to answer all the questions. Do answer the questions that you that feel most relevant. Over to you, Thangham.
Me first. Sorry, I got that wrong. I thought you said Nicholas first. Thank you. Local authorities are, I mean, the role of local authorities, I mean, local authorities are in real deep hole at the moment. They're in deep trouble. They have had to spend a lot of money, which they thought they were going to get back and haven't. And I think any local authority, no matter how committed they are to zero carbon at the moment, if you speak to them about anything at all that's going to cost anything at all without knowing where the money's going to come from, they just throw up their hands in horror. And I have a huge amount of sympathy. I think there's some local councillors on this call, so you probably are aware of this. This, by the way, is definitely not a party political point, in that I know Conservative colleagues who feel just strongly about this as Conservative councillors, who are just really struggling with the impact of the COVID crisis. So that's partly why I really would like the government to bring forward the entirety of its manifesto commitment. There was a question about zero rating of energy products, which I think came later on as well. I think a few people have raised this, Laura. So just wanted to put out there, somebody asked specifically, will Labour be committing to this? I make a point of never writing our election manifesto on a Zoom call, but I do make a point of writing things down with my trusty pen and my trusty notebook and getting in touch with my colleagues in the Treasury team, and particularly my colleagues in our Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy team, so led by one Ed Miliband of this parish, who has a lot of experience in this topic area, but also has several shadow ministers working on it. And I am going to go and talk to them about where are we on different aspects of the financial levers that we could use to help pay for a lot of what's been talked about. And I think that covers, I hope, a couple of questions further down the list, Laura.
Thanks very much. Nicholas. You're on mute, Nick.
Sorry, starting with the VAT, I mean, it seems a bit ludicrous that you can have a meal now with 15% reduction to the VAT rate, but if you insulate your home and try and reduce your carbon footprint, you pay 20% VAT. So I was a bit disappointed that they actually reduced VAT on hospitality rather than on insulation. So I would really support the reduction to 0 on all insulation materials, particularly in things that would reduce carbon footprint. The question as regards to 106, that is a real interesting challenge to all developing RPs like Stonewater. Longer term, our strategy is to do as much land and build, i.e. land that we purchase ourselves and design our own homes. But we do rely a big percentage on 106s. And there's always the challenge that if we don't pay the money for those homes, then another RP will buy them, so we will lose out. And we do feel that we have limited influence, not only on environmental issues, but internal design issues, estate layout issues, etc. So I think that having this competition where the developer will go to the person that's prepared to pay the most leads to a race to the bottom in standards, really. I think that there's been a number of 106 agreements over the years at Stonewater that we've actually bought because they're in areas of really high demand, but they could have been made more sustainable, more attractive, because if we'd have actually been able to influence some of the design at an early stage. And my experience generally is that the developers aren't interested. So I think that is a huge challenge for the sector. As regards to local authorities, I agree with Thangham. I think local authorities have just been so overwhelmed by COVID. And small thing where I live, I've been really pleased I haven't had to pay car parking charges during the pandemic. But of course, that's a lot of income that my local council relied upon. So they've had probably a double or triple whammy, I imagine. So they would need a lot of support to be able to implement this effectively, in my view.
Thanks very much. And Lord Deevan, maybe the kind of on the VAT question, the kind of broader role of financial incentives like that, and the role of those, and potentially also just on that local authority question, do you think, and does the CCC think more generally that local authorities need kind of greater resources and powers to not just on housing actually, but more broadly to kind of to tackle the problems and reduce emissions in their area?
Well, I'm a great believer in the fact that local authorities are the crucial deliverers in so many of these areas, and therefore I'm entirely a believer in that kind of devolution, or devolution generally, but it does seem to me to be very important. I think government has a real role to make sure that the best value for money, I mean real value, not getting it the cheapest, but the best value for money takes place. And I think there are a number of things which we might look back, frankly, to some effective operations, for example, in Liverpool, of which Michael Heseltine managed really interesting cross-party real efforts. And I think some of the mechanisms which he used are really worth bringing back in a modern form. So I'd like to see that, a real mechanisms for getting the sort of value we're talking about for money. I'm dubious about the VAT argument simply because it's very difficult to make sure that you really are spending that money, which is what you are after doing. If you're not taking it in, you're spending that money on precisely what we want. I think there are better ways of ensuring that we get the kind of retrofit, the kind of changes that we want. And I'm not sure that is the best way to spend money. But I do think that there needs to be a whole range of encouragements, and we need to build the system so it works. I've never understood, for example, why the social housing providers are not allowed to take into account, when they're dealing with their rents, the fact that they've managed to spend rather more money on developing the house so that it's got very much lower energy costs. That might be something that could be shared between them and the person who's renting the accommodation. You might be able to get more that way. At every point, we have to look at mechanisms which make this more likely. And I think we've got to get out of the traditional ways of looking at it. So I wouldn't go for VAT reduction myself. What I would do is to have a system whereby it is significantly easier for housing associations, for social landlords, and for homeowners to get the changes in their houses done, the insulation and the rest of it. One last thing. I don't think that we have really faced up to the fundamental issue of the Section 106. What's wrong with that is that no houses should have been built like that. If you set the standards at the level they ought to be, then the issue doesn't arise. And so what we've allowed is people to build, as I'm afraid I go on saying, crap houses. If you make clear that when you build a house, it has to meet the low carbon levels that you demand, then it doesn't matter that the 106 section 106 gets into this position, because the housing association is going to have a house at a level which it ought to be. So I come back to it. The failure of the government, not just this government, previous government, don't want to be party political in any way, but I do think it's different. If you promise to do something well beyond the point at which any of your ministers are going to have to do it, that's a different thing from saying, I'm going to do it now. So I blame everybody. I blame the Labour government for not doing it when it should have done it and putting it off to some other date. I blame the coalition government for not putting it into operation when it should have done. And I blame the Conservative government for not doing it when it should do it. So what I want is it done now. And I don't want any more argument about it. We do it now, we deliver it now. And if I hear a single one of those house builders say they can't do it because it'll be more expensive and they haven't got the ability, I will remind them, they told me that about everything 25 years ago when I was Secretary of State. They always say that until you do it. When you do it, they'll find a way to deliver.
A healthy reminder there of your independence, of the criticism of all governments, and also recognising that all governments haven't, while progress is being made, haven't done enough on these issues. I was just going to come to you, Amy, maybe just on that question around new build and the social housing sector, and then come back to you again with first for the next round as well.
Thanks very much. Well, what can I say to follow that? It's really interesting discussion. I completely agree on the standards approach. We have to make sure that new build standards go far enough, fast enough, and are fit for purpose, so that we don't have to retrofit reasonably new homes. We haven't got time to do it, and we have to make sure that they're constructed the right way so that they're fit for purpose. So when we consulted members on future home standard, they were really supportive of a fabric first approach rather than we heard lots of stories from members about meeting targets by using poor quality technology, huge implications for maintenance and repairs during the lifetime of that property, lack of control over what's specified, so there's a plethora of things that we should be moving away from. Just to touch on the Section 106, I think when I joined the Fed, I was shocked at how much of the sector's supply does come through that route. It's close to 40%. It's a huge amount. But that to me just says that actually this is why we need this opportunity to set out our vision and ambition as a sector, so that we don't, I know it's really easy to say it, very hard to do, but so we don't get to a position where our members are competing for properties that aren't even good enough in the first place. But I would highlight that I have come across one member who they have been in while homes are being built, Section 106 homes are being built, and retrofitted them to a higher standard on site. I know that doesn't work for everybody, and there's huge issues around risk transfer and things, but it occasionally can be done. But I think it's a real challenge to the sector that we absolutely need to stand up and say, this is the thing I was saying about setting out what we need and aspire to, and it not, it has to meet what we need for the future. We have to be strong on that point.
Thanks very much, Amy. So I'm just going to go back to Lara for another round of questions.
Thanks to everyone for answering those questions. They're really good answers. So I'm going to go with a few more questions now. So this one's from Neil. The approach outlined seems to focus on heat pumps as the preferred replacement heating option. There is also an acknowledgement of the impact of investment in alternate heating system on low-income families. However, what work has been done to model the effects of the increased running costs of heat pump systems when compared to gas boilers? At present, the cost of gas as an energy source is far cheaper than electric. Another one from Madeline, which follows on really well from the local authority question earlier, is what tools do the panel think local authorities need alongside funding to lead decarbonisation of home heating in their areas? This one is specifically for Lord Deben, not often want to disagree with you. However, I think caution is required around the emphasis placed on hybrid heat pumps. There will inevitably be instances where a dwelling and household is perfectly well suited to a full heat pump solution now, but will end up with a gas hybrid for many potential reasons. There is scope that hybrids may just, in some cases, kick the carbon saving can down the road. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So I'll go back to Amy first for any answers on those questions. Then I'll go to Nick, then Thangham and Lord Deben. And I will try and stick to that order this time.
Thanks very much. So I'd like to say on the heat pumps, I'm absolutely not an expert on this area at all, although I do know that there were some very particular points raised about this issue when we consulted members on the use of heat pumps. So whilst they recognise the validity of using that technology, they were really key to make sure it was understood that how we transition from gas and when heat pumps are fitted, so that you make sure you do the energy efficiency work first around the walls and roof and windows of the building, so you're reducing your energy use to start off with, so that you get the most efficient and effective use of any heat pump. And I think there have been scenarios where that hasn't quite aligned, and there have been really huge costs. But I think there's also, we need to take on board much more discussion and education around behavioural change and cultural change, around lifestyles and what makes energy bills go up in the future, and how we live in homes, because they are going to be a bit different. You know, living in an airtight home with a heat pump is very different than living in a non-insulated house with lots of leaks and a gas boiler. And you know, we need to put enough resource and work into making sure that that is better understood. And if we do get to the point where we're doing pilots as well, we need to be properly monitoring performance and making sure that we understand why that happens. And that needs to feed back, that level of monitoring and data needs to feed back into standards and our performance overall. Otherwise, you know, we know now that we build homes and there's a huge performance gap between what is designed and what's actually built. Can't really afford to not close that learning curve. In terms of local authorities, it's really tough. They've got such a hard job to do, mainly around coordination. You know, I just think about the road I live on, there's probably 3 or 4 different tenures, all in terraces. How on earth do you sort of bring people together to do that? So I think they will need incentives, and then need variations of how they can respond to particular areas, and how they can you know, negotiate with around planning controls and various other things. So, you know, ways of them controlling development and communicating with the local community. They're going to need a range of options, because there's no one size fits all. So you might need to be able to offset some emissions from an area where it's prohibitively expensive or very challenging, like a really strict conservation area or historic area, versus one where, you know, there's space for a solution to treat a load of homes because it's in a large plot of land and you can put a heat pump in. And you know, I'm probably not being completely clear, but we really do need to think about the specifics of the challenges that they'll face, and think about where they might be able to have leverage, and actually talk to them as well. And I think this really links in with the idea of the government having a strategic overview, so that they can match up capacity and resources and experience to help local authorities.
Thanks very much. It's actually on the affordability point around heat pumps. It's something that we state in the report, actually, that there is a potential for when heat pumps are installed with high energy efficiency measures, for the energy bills actually to be lower than with gas and high energy efficiency measures, not least because the energy demand is so low in the former scenario. But heat pumps do need to be allied to high energy efficiency measures in order to avoid high running costs. Nicholas.
Well, you've just said what I was going to say, Luke. So, I mean, we've had experience of putting ground source heat pumps into rural communities, and yeah, it's a bit like fish and chips. If you put a heat pump in without the required insulation, then the two go together. So if you don't have the required insulation, then generally it is more expensive than fossil fuels if you have fossil fuels in the locality. So what the report is very clear on is that heat pump is the solution, along with the ventilation and the insulation required to that home, so the retrofitting. If you don't do that, then you will have a solution which isn't fit for purpose, probably. We're involved in a project, as I said during my introduction, over in Oxford, where we're working with Cancer, and we're actually working with Octopus, the energy supplier, who's got a tariff which is called a time of use tariff, which this project is looking to see whether, by way of the installation and the tariffs, whether it can be equal to the cost of gas boilers. Because the one thing that we're all saying today is, our client group, our customers, are some of the poorer members of our community, and we don't want to do anything that increases their fuel costs. Everything we should be doing should be reducing the fuel costs, not increasing it. So we'd be determined to do that as part of this project. Coming back to local authorities, I mean, that's going to be a huge challenge. What I found particularly exciting in this report, interestingly, was probably the mundane things like council tax and stamp duty, because a lot of homeowners, particularly ones that are relatively affluent, aren't that incentivized to actually do the energy efficiency that they require to their own homes, and that's going to be very difficult for councils or anybody's to sort of get that delivered. So by looking to see how you can incentivize homeowners by way of council tax or stamp duty, I thought that was something really quite innovative and actually something that could make a real difference. So we do need to use I think the tax system to encourage behaviour or discourage behaviour, and I think that the ideas in the report are something which I thought really were very helpful and interesting.
Thanks. Thank
I'm going to just focus on the local authorities. I think the powers they could do with is the ability to regulate and enforce regulations over owners of homes. And that's across all sectors. And at the moment, regulatory powers that local authorities have to enforce high standards are comparatively weak. They have some. I think they could do with more. Certainly my local authority is telling me about the concerns they have about public money often being spent on homes that definitely do not meet high standards of energy efficiency and insulation. That public money goes out into the private housing sector, the private rented sector in various different ways. That doesn't mean all private landlords are bad, because they're not. Actually, loads of them are doing a brilliant job, and not all social landlords are good. There's a real mixture, as other speakers have said. But I think what's difficult is when these different sectors are pitted against each other and the local authority is powerless to intervene adequately in order to incentivize good behaviour across all owners across all three sectors. So I'd like them to have more power, and it's particularly is that in my experience, local authorities, local authority councillors often know, I think the report actually says this somewhere, about they know on a house by house basis where the problems are. I certainly do across my constituency, street by street, I think probably more than house by house, but my councillors, they definitely do, and I'd like them to have the power to be able to fix things.
Thanks very much. Lord Deben.
Well, I agree that we need local councils to enforce and to inspect. The trouble is that they don't even use the powers they've got. Every new house, when they put in a condensing boiler, is supposed to send a note to the local authority to say that the condensing boiler has actually been set properly. Because as you know, if you don't set it properly, it's worse than having a non-condensing boiler. I've never known a local authority that followed up to check whether that was true or not. The truth is that there is also a financial ability to afford this. I think enforcement and inspection is crucially important. And I have a number of views about what one, not from the Climate Change Committee, but I personally think that I would like to be very much more open to people being able, on estates built since the war, to make changes in their houses if they want to put something over the garage, or want to put a garage in, all that sort of thing. I think that's a matter of neighbourly argument and about somebody being an arbitrator. I don't think it's anything to do with planning, as a matter of fact. Take that problem out of the planning departments, they'd have the resources actually to do this job, which is their real job, which is the enforcement of proper rules and regulations about quality. And we really do need to do that. So we've got to find some ways. Once again, it's not just a question of saying they must have some more money, because clearly we're going through a period in which more money is going to be very difficult, and we want that money to go to the right places. I'm not asking for no spending. I want very considerable spending. But if we want very considerable spending, let's try to find ways in which we can free up local authorities to do the job which is much more important, which is the job to see that if a house is built, it really is built to the standards it's supposed to be built to. And I'd give them really strong powers. I think if you build a house and it doesn't meet the building regulations, you should pull it down. I think there should be no question. And when you only have to do that twice, you'd soon find that people actually met the regulations. But you know what they do at the moment, just for people to understand, what they do is to build a house, call it the Cotswolds. I hope there isn't one called the Cotswolds, I'll be in trouble, but they call it something. Let's say they call it Seringapatam. This is our Seringapatam house. So they then say to the local authority, we're going to build 10 Seringapatams. And we've got this bit of paper which shows that the Seringapatam we built has passed all the rules and regulations. Now, the truth is, of course, the first Seringapatam they build is absolutely perfect. It meets all the demands because you build it to do that. But my goodness me, every other Seringapatam they build doesn't have the same care. So that local authorities should be inspecting that. But again, I've very, very rarely found examples where local authorities do the kind of inspection. And then you do want to give them the powers to say, well, I'm sorry, you may have said that, but it doesn't actually meet the regulations. So you pull it down and rebuild it. That's it. And as I say, take 2 of those and we would soon get to a situation in which people met what their requirements were, which is a crucially important part of this whole thing.
Thanks very much. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to just ask one final question, and just kind of any final thoughts. I think mine really is just kind of taking us back to the beginning, which I said in my opening remarks, which is around the degree of change and how much it's going to kind of affect people's lives much more directly than the decarbonisation of the energy system is seen, which has largely been done in the background. So my question really is, do you think the public are ready? And if not, how can we ensure, and even if they are, but how can we ensure that the public are really involved in the transition, yes, in housing, but also more broadly across policy as well? And I'll go to Amy Thangham, Lord Demon, and then I'll give the last word to Nicholas. Amy.
Thanks. I think we basically have to do more asking and listening, but also I think there's room for greater sort of communication, not only from government but from all of us who are involved in the sector, and the reasons why we do have to decarbonise, and that we have to do it now, that there's no more waiting around. So I think there's a real opportunity in a lot of ways, and who's to say that residents and the general public won't be able to have ideas that actually could be really fantastic and supportive. If you don't ask, you don't get. And we won't actually be able to work through some of the barriers or think about like how we can approach some of these really challenging issues without involving everyone.
That's great, thank you. Thangham.
Earlier on this year, I might have answered differently, but I think my experience of seeing how willing the public were to put aside private interest for greater public good in the last 4 months, overwhelmingly, people have made extraordinary sacrifices, often for no particular benefit to themselves, other than wanting everybody to be safe. I think that sets a really striking tone and a good example of the fact that if a government is prepared to take real leadership and say, this is what we need to do, that there is a way of bringing the public with them. Now, that hasn't been consistent across all parts of the COVID response. I'm not going to say this has been a perfect response because I don't think it has, but I think it's given us an example of the public being willing to do that. but it needs to have that voice. I think that how can we involve them? I think social landlords in particular are really good when they're at their best. They're really good at involving the residents and really thinking about residents' lives and understanding residents' lives, but also being led by residents. And I would like to see more tenant boards or resident representatives on boards of social landlords, but also finding a way of doing that for the private sector as well. I think that's really important because people do have good ideas and need to be involved. These changes are going to be sustainable.
Thanks. Lord Deeban.
Well, I think the fundamental thing we have to do is to talk about it in language which everyone understands. One of the things I did when I first became chairman of the Climate Change Committee was say that we were no longer able to use the word kilowatt hour, because I don't know what a kilowatt hour is. I can't feel it, I can't see it. So when you say it's so, and so I've no idea how much it costs, if you see what I mean, because I don't know the connection between a kilowatt hour and the fire that I turn on. So you've got to talk about bills. You've got to talk about this is why we did this work on showing how actually bills were falling because of much more energy efficient boilers and the like. Whereas the cost of energy was actually rising, but it was the question is what people understand. They understand about bills, don't understand about kilowatt hours. So my first step would be, for goodness sake, we've got to talk about these things in a way they understand. We've all been talking about air source heat pumps. That means absolutely nothing to most people. And the trouble is that the people who install these heat pumps are even worse at explaining it than we are. So that the other thing is we have actually to educate the intermediaries so that they can do this kind of discussion more effectively. And I think one of the biggest thing, therefore, and this is for me the most important thing, is that we have to have two mechanisms we don't at the moment. We need a one-stop shop where the private owner can go and say, I want to do this properly. Who do I go to locally? Who's safe to have in my house? Who's actually not going to rip me off? And also, what are the questions? What are the choices? Where do I come? How do I do this in language I understand? And then as far as social landlords, I think an awful lot of landlords actually don't get it right because they themselves don't understand it. Now, Nicholas, I'm very complimentary about a whole range of your colleagues, and I won't even mention the one. There's one very large one which doesn't know anything about what its customers actually think. It doesn't have a mechanism in which they can actually involve themselves. And one of the reasons is I don't think they understand themselves what it is that they're trying to do along these lines. So I think education in the sense of opening this up so that people can give their views. They won't give their views on these matters if you talk about air source heat pumps. But if you talk about how do we reduce the energy, your bills, by making your house cheaper to heat, let's talk about what you need, then you'll begin to get some real response to the public.
Thanks very much. Nicholas.
That's a bit hard to follow that, isn't it? We do talk a lot to our residents, and we're very keen to engage with our residents. And Lord Debden is right. You mentioned air source heat pumps. People glaze over and you've lost people straight away. So it's actually talking about, you know, as Lord Debden said, about energy bills, but also about reducing impact on the planet. And people are very signed up now to trying to reduce their impact on the planet. And one of the positives, you know, one of the small positives that I think has come from the pandemic is the massive reduction in, you know, people driving places, flying places, etc. And, you know, as a business, we're certainly looking to see how we can, you know, minimise our, you know, carbon footprint moving forward. So I think, we need to talk to our customers, we need to listen to them, and we need to provide easy methods of heating, methods that are easy to understand and very convenient to use. People don't want to have a PhD to know how to work a boiler or or whatever. So it needs to be easy, and it needs to be cheap, and they need to understand that how it's going to have a positive impact on the planet.
Luke, can I just say that last comment by Nicholas is so important. Have you ever tried to change the air conditioning in a hotel room? It's totally impossible. The system is worked so that nobody who is not a geek can do it. You need to have simplicity, and you need to recognize that most people don't care about these things. They want it simple. Make it easy to be good and difficult to be bad, is my view.
Thanks very much. I think that's a really nice way to end it on how we kind of engage the public and the overwhelming need to keep things simple. It's certainly a lesson for all think tanks as well when we're writing and communicating our work. But I just wanted to say thanks so much for everyone for participating, particularly to our speakers, to Stonewater for working with us and supporting this research. A bit of a shout out to the lead authors on the report, Jonathan Webb and Josh Emden within my team, and also to Lara for supporting us and the rest of the events team in putting on this event. I should say that this will be submitted as evidence to our Cross-Party Environmental Justice Commission, which is looking at how we achieve, how we decarbonise the economy and restore nature, but also do so in a fair way, tackling wider economic and social injustices. And do look out for many more upcoming briefs and reports from the Commission in the coming months, and the final report is due next year. And just on public involvement, we are going to be carrying out 4 citizens' juries across the country in areas where we think there's particular issues around decarbonisation, to understand what the public want and how they want to see change in their area. But once again, thanks to the speakers and thanks to everyone for attending.
Thank you.